Sarah Martinez never imagined that her small hands, trained to heal wounds and save lives, would one day grip the most powerful sniper rifle in the world. Growing up in a quiet farming town in Iowa, she was the girl who rescued injured birds and spent her weekends volunteering at the local animal shelter. Her dream was simple: become a nurse and help people feel better. When Sarah turned 18, her family faced a financial crisis. Her father's farm was struggling, and college seemed impossible. The military recruiter who visited her high school painted a picture of opportunity. "Join the Navy," he said, "and they'll train you as a medic. You'll save lives and earn money for college." It sounded perfect for a girl who wanted nothing more than to help others. Basic training was harder than anything Sarah had ever experienced. She was one of only 12 women in her company of 80 recruits. The drill instructors pushed everyone to their limits, but they seemed especially tough on the women. Sarah's bunkmate, a tough girl from Chicago, quit after 3 weeks. "This isn't for me," she said, packing her bags. "They treat us like we don't belong here." Sarah almost quit, too. During week 4, she collapsed during a 10-mile run. Her legs felt like rubber, and her lungs burned with each breath. As she lay on the hot asphalt, gasping for air, her drill instructor stood over her. "Martinez," he shouted, "you think the enemy will wait for you to catch your breath? Get up!" Something inside Sarah snapped. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for every girl back home who was told she wasn't strong enough, smart enough, or tough enough. She pushed herself off the ground and finished that run, even though she came in last. From that day forward, she never gave up again. Hospital Corps School was where Sarah truly found her calling. She learned to stop bleeding wounds in seconds, perform emergency surgery in the field, and keep soldiers alive when every second counted. Her instructors noticed something special about her. While other students memorized procedures, Sarah understood the human body like she was born to heal it. "Martinez," her chief instructor said after a particularly difficult trauma simulation, "you have something most medics take years to develop. You stay calm when everyone else panics. That's going to save lives someday." Sarah's first assignment was aboard the USS Independence, a medical support ship. For 6 months, she treated seasick sailors and performed routine medical checks. It was important work, but she felt restless. She had trained for emergency medicine, not checking temperatures and giving flu shots. Everything changed when she received orders to join a Special Operations Medical Unit. She would be assigned to support Navy SEAL teams in Afghanistan. Sarah was thrilled, but also nervous. She had never been in combat before, and she wondered if she could handle the pressure. The flight to Afghanistan took 18 hours. Sarah sat between 2 male medics who had both deployed before. They talked about firefights and IED explosions like they were discussing the weather. "First deployment?" one asked her. When she nodded, he smiled. "Don't worry. Just stay low and do your job. The SEALs will protect you." Sarah bristled at his words. She didn't want to be protected, she wanted to be useful. She spent the rest of the flight studying her medical protocols and checking her equipment. Her medical bag contained everything from bandages to morphine to emergency surgical tools. She had practiced with every item hundreds of times. The military base in Afghanistan was unlike anything Sarah had imagined. Dust covered everything, and the constant sound of helicopters filled the air. The temperature reached 115 degrees during the day and dropped to 40 degrees at night. Her quarters were a small metal container shared with 3 other female personnel. On her first day, Sarah met the SEAL team she would support. They were led by Chief Petty Officer Jake Tank Thompson, a massive man with arms like tree trunks and eyes that seemed to see everything. He had served 8 deployments and was respected by everyone on base. When Sarah introduced herself, he looked her up and down skeptically. "How old are you?" he asked bluntly. 22, Chief," Sarah replied, standing as straight as possible. "And how much combat experience do you have?" "None, Chief, but I'm the best medic you'll find." Tank's teammates chuckled, but he didn't smile. Medicine and combat are two different things, Martinez. When bullets start flying, training sometimes goes out the window. I need to know you won't freeze up when my boys need you. Sarah met his stare without blinking. I won't let you down, Chief. The first few weeks were frustrating for Sarah. The SEAL team conducted training exercises and planning sessions, but they always left her behind. She spent her days treating minor injuries and illnesses at the base medical facility. It was important work, but she felt like she was wasting her specialized training. One evening, Sarah found Tank in the base gym, lifting weights that seemed impossibly heavy. She approached him nervously. Chief, can I ask you something? Tank continued his exercise but nodded for her to continue. Why won't you let me train with the team? I need to know your tactics and procedures if I'm going to be effective in the field. Tank set down the weights and turned to face her. Martinez, do you know what happened to the last medic who went out with us? Sarah shook her head. IED explosion. He was so focused on treating a wounded Afghan soldier that he didn't see the Taliban fighter coming up behind him. One of my boys had to choose between taking the shot to save the medic or maintaining his overwatch position. He saved the medic, but it left us vulnerable for 30 seconds. In combat, 30 seconds might as well be 30 years. Sarah processed this information carefully. What if I could be more than just a medic? What if I could contribute to the mission while still being ready to treat casualties? Tank studied her face for a long moment. What do you mean? Teach me to shoot. Teach me tactics. Make me a real part of the team instead of just someone you have to protect. Tank was quiet for several minutes. Finally, he spoke. Be at the range tomorrow at 500. Bring your M4. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the shooting range 30 minutes early. Her M4 rifle was clean and ready. She had qualified with the weapon during basic training, but she knew that qualifying and being combat ready were very different things. Tank arrived with 3 other team members: Rodriguez, a sniper from Texas; Johnson, an explosives expert from Maine; and Davis, a communications specialist from California. They were all experienced operators who had saved each other's lives multiple times. Okay, Martinez, Tank said. Show us what you can do. Sarah took her position and fired at targets 50 meters away. Her shots were accurate but slow. She was thinking too much about each trigger pull instead of letting her training take over. Not bad, Rodriguez said. But in combat, you need to be faster. The enemy won't wait for you to line up the perfect shot. For the next 2 hours, they worked with Sarah on speed shooting, movement drills, and combat reloads. She was exhausted but determined to prove herself. By the end of the session, she was hitting targets quickly and accurately while moving. Better, Tank admitted grudgingly, but shooting at paper targets is easy. Combat is different. That afternoon, Tank invited Sarah to join the team for a close-quarters combat exercise. They would practice clearing buildings and responding to ambushes using simulated ammunition. Sarah was nervous but excited. The exercise began with the team approaching a mock village. Sarah stayed in the center of the formation as they had taught her, ready to treat casualties while also watching for threats. Everything went smoothly until they entered the 3rd building. Suddenly, pop-up targets appeared from multiple directions. The team engaged them quickly, but Sarah hesitated for a split second. In that moment of hesitation, a target that she should have engaged shot Johnson. The exercise ended immediately. Dead, Tank announced flatly. Johnson is dead because Martinez didn't take the shot. Sarah felt sick to her stomach. In a real combat situation, her hesitation could have cost a man his life. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Sorry doesn't bring back the dead, Tank replied harshly. Then his voice softened slightly. But everyone hesitates the first time. The question is whether you'll learn from it. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She replayed the exercise over and over in her mind, thinking about what she could have done differently. She realized that being a combat medic meant accepting that sometimes she would have to take a life to save a life. The next morning, Sarah approached Tank again. "I want to run that exercise again." Tank studied her determined expression. "You sure you're ready?" "I'm ready." This time, when the targets appeared, Sarah didn't hesitate. She engaged threats quickly and accurately, while still maintaining awareness of her medical responsibilities. The team completed the exercise flawlessly. "Much better," Tank said afterward. "You might actually be useful after all." Over the next 3 weeks, Sarah trained intensively with the SEAL team. She learned their hand signals, their movement techniques, and their standard operating procedures. More importantly, she learned to think like a warrior while maintaining the heart of a healer. Rodriguez taught her advanced marksmanship techniques. Johnson showed her how to identify and avoid explosive devices. Davis explained tactical communications. Tank supervised everything, pushing her harder than she had ever been pushed before. Sarah's medical skills also impressed the team. During one training scenario, Tank simulated a severe arterial injury. Sarah had the bleeding controlled and an IV started before Tank could even finish describing the wound. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, and her calm demeanor never wavered. "I've seen a lot of medics," Tank told her one evening, "but you're different. You don't just know the procedures, you understand them. That intuitive understanding is what separates good medics from great ones." Sarah felt proud, but she also knew that training and combat were different things. She wouldn't really know if she belonged until she faced the real test. That test came sooner than anyone expected. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value Taliban commander was meeting with bomb makers in a village 40 kilometers from the base. The mission was to capture the commander and gather intelligence about planned attacks. Tank called the team together for the briefing. "This is a capture mission," he explained, "but the intelligence suggests heavy security. We need to be prepared for a fight." Sarah listened carefully as Tank outlined the mission. They would insert by helicopter under cover of darkness, surround the target building, and attempt to capture the commander alive. Sarah would stay with the command element, ready to treat casualties and provide covering fire if needed. "Martinez," Tank said, looking directly at her, "this is your first real mission. Are you ready?" Sarah nodded firmly. "I'm ready, Chief." Tank studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Good. Get your gear ready. We leave at midnight." Sarah spent the rest of the day preparing her medical equipment and checking her weapons. She had trained for this moment for months, but now that it was here, she felt a mixture of excitement and fear. She thought about her family back in Iowa and wondered what they would think if they knew their farm girl was about to go into combat with Navy SEALs. As the sun set over the Afghan mountains, Sarah said a quiet prayer. She asked for strength, courage, and the ability to save lives when the moment came. She didn't know it yet, but in a few hours, she would face a test that would change not only her life, but the lives of every man on her team. The helicopter rotors began spinning, and Tank gave the signal to load up. Sarah grabbed her medical bag and weapon and followed the team toward their destiny. In the darkness ahead lay a village where she would prove that being just a medic was about to take on an entirely new meaning. The helicopter flew low through the mountain valleys, its rotors cutting through the cold night air. Sarah sat between Rodriguez and Johnson, her medical bag secured between her feet and her rifle across her lap. The team had been quiet during the flight, each man focused on the mission ahead. Through her night vision goggles, Sarah could see the rugged Afghan landscape passing below. Ancient villages dotted the valleys, their mud brick buildings barely visible in the darkness. This was a land that had seen centuries of conflict, and tonight she would become part of that history. Tank's voice crackled through the radio headset. 5 minutes to target. Final equipment check. Sarah ran her hands over her gear one last time. Her medical supplies were organized exactly as she had trained. Trauma bandages, morphine, IV fluids, and emergency surgical tools were all within easy reach. Her M4 rifle was loaded with a full magazine, and she carried 6 additional magazines on her vest. The helicopter began its descent toward the landing zone, a flat area about 1 kilometer from the target village. Sarah's heart rate increased as the reality of the situation set in. In a few minutes, she would be in a real combat zone with real enemies who wanted to kill her and her teammates. The aircraft touched down softly in a cloud of dust. Tank was the first out, followed by his team. Sarah exited last, immediately moving to her assigned position in the formation. The helicopter departed quickly, leaving them alone in the hostile territory. Tank used hand signals to communicate as they moved toward the village. Sarah stayed in the center of the formation, constantly scanning for threats while remaining ready to provide medical aid. The weight of her equipment felt heavier than it had during training, and every shadow seemed to hide an enemy. The village was larger than Sarah had expected. Intelligence reports had described a small settlement, but she counted at least 50 buildings. Many were connected by high walls and narrow alleyways, creating a maze that would be difficult to navigate and easy to defend. Rodriguez, their sniper, moved to an elevated position overlooking the target building. Johnson and Davis flanked left and right, while Tank and Sarah approached from the front. The plan was to surround the building and call for the commander to surrender. If he refused, they would have to go in and get him. Through her earpiece, Sarah heard Rodriguez whisper, "I count 6 guards around the target building. They're armed with AK-47s and at least 1 RPG. Tank acknowledged the report and adjusted the plan. The guards would have to be neutralized before they could attempt the capture. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she realized that men were about to die. The attack began with Rodriguez taking out the guard with the RPG. The man dropped silently, and for a moment, everything remained quiet. Then all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions around the village. The Taliban had been expecting them. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as bullets whizzed past Sarah's head. Tank grabbed her arm and pulled her behind a low wall. "It's an ambush!" Tank shouted into his radio. "We're taking heavy fire from all sides." Sarah pressed herself against the wall as bullets chipped away chunks of mud brick above her head. This was nothing like the training exercises. The sound was overwhelming, and the smell of gunpowder filled the air. Her hands shook as she gripped her rifle. Through the chaos, she heard Johnson's voice on the radio. "I'm hit! I'm hit!" Without thinking, Sarah looked over the wall toward Johnson's position. She could see him lying in the open, clutching his leg. Blood was spreading across his pants, and he was unable to move to cover. "I'm going to get him," Sarah told Tank. Tank grabbed her arm firmly. "Negative. Too much crossfire. We'll get him when we suppress their fire." But Sarah could see that Johnson was losing blood quickly. Every second they waited increased the chance that he would go into shock or bleed out. She had trained for this exact situation, but the training had never included bullets flying overhead. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio. "Multiple shooters in the building across from Johnson. I can't get a clear shot." Sarah studied the situation. Johnson was about 30 meters away, lying in an alley between 2 buildings. Taliban fighters were shooting from windows and rooftops, creating a deadly crossfire. Reaching him would require crossing open ground under enemy fire. "Tank," Sarah said urgently. "I have to go now. He's losing too much blood." Tank looked at her for a long moment. Sarah could see the conflict in his eyes. His job was to complete the mission and protect his team. Sending her into that crossfire went against every tactical principle he had ever learned. "Cover me," Sarah said, not waiting for his permission. Before Tank could stop her, Sarah vaulted over the wall and sprinted toward Johnson. Immediately, enemy fire concentrated on her position. Bullets struck the ground around her feet and whistled past her ears. She ran in a zigzag pattern just as she had been taught, but the distance seemed endless. She dove into the alley next to Johnson just as a burst of automatic fire shattered the wall where she had been standing. Her hands were shaking, but she forced herself to focus on Johnson's wound. "Hey, Doc," Johnson said weakly, trying to smile despite his pain. "Looks like I stepped in it this time." Sarah quickly assessed the injury. A bullet had struck Johnson's femur, causing significant bleeding but missing the major artery. She could stabilize him, but they needed to get out of the kill zone quickly. "You're going to be fine," Sarah told him as she applied pressure to the wound. "But we need to move." Johnson tried to stand, but collapsed immediately. "I can't put weight on it, Doc. You're going to have to leave me." "Not happening," Sarah replied firmly. She wrapped a pressure bandage around his leg and injected him with morphine for the pain. "Tank, I need covering fire. We're coming out." Tank's voice was tense. "Negative, Martinez. Too dangerous. Wait for us to clear the shooters." Sarah looked around the alley. They were trapped between enemy positions with limited cover. Johnson was getting weaker, and she knew they couldn't wait much longer. She needed to make a decision. "Rodriguez," she called on the radio. "Can you see the building with the shooters?" "Affirmative. Second floor, third window from the left." Sarah had an idea, but it was risky. She pulled out a smoke grenade and showed it to Johnson. "When I pop this, we're going to move. I'll carry you, but you need to help as much as you can." Johnson nodded weakly. Sarah pulled the pin on the grenade and threw it into the open area between their position and safety. White smoke billowed up, creating a screen that would hide their movement, but also blind them. Sarah helped Johnson to his feet and wrapped his arm around her shoulders. He was much heavier than she had expected, and her legs trembled under the weight. They began moving toward Tank's position, guided only by memory and the sound of friendly voices. Bullets continued to fly through the smoke, but the enemy shooters were firing blind. Sarah focused on putting one foot in front of the other, supporting Johnson while trying to stay low. Her medical bag bounced against her back with each step. They were halfway to safety when Johnson stumbled and nearly fell. Sarah caught him, but the effort threw her off balance. They both went down hard, landing in a tangle of arms and legs. "Come on," Sarah panted, trying to help Johnson back up. "We're almost there." That's when she heard the distinctive sound of an RPG being fired. The rocket-propelled grenade whooshed overhead and exploded against a building behind them. The blast wave knocked them flat and filled the air with debris. Sarah's ears were ringing, but she forced herself to move. Johnson was unconscious, either from the pain, the morphine, or the blast. She grabbed him under the arms and began dragging him toward Tank's position. Tank appeared out of the smoke like a ghost, his rifle ready. "Martinez, this way!" Together, they dragged Johnson to safety behind a thick wall. Sarah immediately began checking his vital signs while Tank provided security. Johnson's pulse was weak but steady, and his breathing was shallow but regular. "He's stable for now," Sarah reported, "but I need to get him proper medical attention soon." Tank nodded and spoke into his radio. "All units, we need immediate extraction. We have one urgent casualty." The response was not what they wanted to hear. "Extraction helicopter is taking fire at the landing zone. They can't land until we clear the area." Sarah realized that the mission had become a fight for survival. They were outnumbered and surrounded, with a wounded teammate and no way out. The Taliban had planned this ambush carefully, and it was working. Davis's voice came through the radio with more bad news. "I count at least 20 fighters moving in on our position. They're trying to surround us." Tank made a quick decision. "All units fall back to the compound. We'll make our stand there." The compound was a 2-story building about 100 meters away. It had thick walls and a good view of the surrounding area. If they could reach it, they could hold out until help arrived, but moving Johnson that distance under enemy fire would be extremely difficult. Sarah looked at Tank and saw the same concern in his eyes. They needed a miracle, and they needed it fast. That's when Rodriguez's calm voice came through the radio. "Chief, I have an idea, but you're not going to like it." "Talk to me," Tank replied. "There's a Barrett 50 cal in that compound. Previous team left it behind. If someone can reach it and provide overwatch, the rest of you can move Johnson safely." Sarah knew about the Barrett 50 caliber sniper rifle. It was one of the most powerful weapons in the military arsenal, capable of stopping vehicles and penetrating heavy cover, but it was also extremely heavy and difficult to operate. Only highly trained snipers typically used it. "Who's going to operate it?" Tank asked. "Rodriguez is pinned down, and none of us are trained on the Barrett." Sarah surprised herself by speaking up. "I can do it." Tank stared at her in disbelief. "Martinez, that's a 50 cal, not your M4. Do you even know how to operate it?" "I trained on it during advanced marksmanship," Sarah said, which was only partially true. She had fired the weapon once during a demonstration, but she understood the principles. More importantly, she was the only one who could move freely while the others were tied down by enemy fire. Tank considered the options quickly. They were running out of time, and conventional tactics weren't working. Sometimes desperate situations required desperate measures. "Do it," he decided. "Rodriguez, guide her to the weapon. Everyone else prepare to move Johnson on my signal." Sarah checked Johnson's bandages one more time, then looked at Tank. "Take care of him. I'll provide overwatch from the compound." Tank grabbed her arm as she prepared to leave. "Martinez, if you can't operate that Barrett, don't try to be a hero. Just find good cover and wait for extraction." Sarah nodded, but she knew that waiting wasn't an option. Johnson needed medical evacuation, and her teammates needed covering fire. The Barrett 50 cal might be their only chance to turn the tide of this battle. She took a deep breath, checked her equipment one final time, and prepared to make the most important run of her life. The compound was 100 meters away through enemy territory. If she could reach it and get that massive rifle operational, she might be able to save her team. If not, they would all die in this forgotten village in the mountains of Afghanistan. Sarah said a quick prayer, then sprinted into the darkness toward the compound. Behind her, Tank watched with a mixture of pride and fear as his young medic disappeared into the chaos of battle. He had trained her well, but now everything depended on her ability to become something she had never been before: a sniper. The sound of her footsteps faded into the gunfire, and Tank began preparing to move Johnson. In a few minutes, they would learn whether their faith in Sarah Martinez had been justified, or whether they had just sent their medic to her death. Sarah's boots pounded against the rocky ground as she sprinted toward the compound through the darkness. Muzzle flashes lit up the night around her like deadly fireworks, and the crack of bullets filled the air. She had never run so fast in her life, driven by desperation and the knowledge that her teammates' lives depended on her success. The compound loomed ahead, a two-story mud brick structure that offered both sanctuary and opportunity. Sarah could see the Taliban fighters repositioning to surround Tank's position. They moved with practiced efficiency, clearly familiar with this terrain and confident in their numerical advantage. Sarah reached the compound's entrance and paused for a moment to catch her breath. The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar, and she could see darkness beyond. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and slipped inside. The first floor was empty except for scattered furniture and debris from previous battles. Sarah moved quickly but carefully, her rifle ready and her medical training making her acutely aware of potential hiding spots for enemy fighters. The building seemed abandoned, but she couldn't afford to take chances. Rodriguez's voice crackled in her earpiece. "Martinez, the Barrett should be on the second floor northeast corner. Previous intel indicated they left it there during the last mission." Sarah found the stairs and began climbing, her heart pounding with each step. The wooden steps creaked under her weight, and she winced at the sound. If there were enemies in the building, they would hear her coming. The second floor was larger than the first, with several rooms opening off a central hallway. Sarah moved toward the northeast corner, guided by Rodriguez's directions. She pushed open a door and found herself in what had once been a bedroom. There, leaning against the far wall like a sleeping giant, was the Barrett M82 50 caliber sniper rifle. Sarah had seen the weapon before during training, but holding it was different. The Barrett was massive, weighing over 30 pounds and measuring nearly 4 feet long. Its scope was as big as her forearm, and the ammunition looked more like small artillery shells than bullets. She lifted the rifle carefully, surprised by its weight and balance. The Barrett had been designed for long-range precision shooting, capable of hitting targets over a mile away. In the right hands, it could stop vehicles, penetrate armor, and eliminate threats that conventional weapons couldn't touch. Sarah quickly inspected the weapon. It was loaded with a 10-round magazine of 50 caliber ammunition. The scope was already zeroed, and the rifle appeared to be in good working condition. She had fired this exact model once during advanced training, but that had been on a controlled range with an instructor guiding every shot. Rodriguez's voice brought her back to reality. "Martinez, what's your status?" "I have the Barrett," Sarah replied, moving to a window that overlooked the battlefield. "Setting up Overwatch now." Through the scope, Sarah could see the situation clearly for the first time. Tank and Davis were pinned behind a low wall with the unconscious Johnson between them. Taliban fighters were moving to flank their position from 3 directions, closing in like wolves around wounded prey. Sarah could also see Rodriguez on a rooftop about 200 meters away. He was trapped behind a chimney, unable to move without exposing himself to enemy fire. His normal rifle was accurate, but it lacked the power to penetrate the heavy cover that many Taliban fighters were using. "Tank," Sarah called on the radio. "I'm in position. I can see the whole battlefield from here." Tank's voice was strained but relieved. "Good. We need to move Johnson in 30 seconds. Can you suppress the fighters on our left flank?" Sarah swung the Barrett's scope toward the left flank. 3 Taliban fighters were using a stone wall for cover, preparing to rush Tank's position. They were confident in their protection, not realizing that the Barrett could punch through their cover like paper. Sarah had never shot at human beings before. All her training had been on paper targets and simulations. But as she watched the fighters preparing to attack her teammates, she felt a calm determination settle over her. These men wanted to kill Johnson, Tank, Davis, and Rodriguez. She couldn't let that happen. She aligned the crosshairs on the center fighter and took a slow, deep breath. The Barrett's trigger was heavier than her M4, requiring more pressure to fire. Sarah squeezed steadily just as she had been taught. The rifle erupted with a sound like thunder. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, much harder than she had remembered from training. But through the scope, she saw the massive bullet strike the stone wall and punch completely through it. The fighter behind the wall dropped immediately. The other 2 fighters scrambled for different cover, clearly shocked by the power of the weapon. They had never faced a Barrett 50 caliber before and didn't understand how it could defeat their protection. "Good shot, Martinez," Tank called out. "Moving Johnson now." Sarah watched through the scope as Tank and Davis lifted Johnson and began carrying him toward the compound. She scanned for threats, ready to engage anyone who tried to stop them. A Taliban fighter appeared in a second-story window, aiming an RPG at Tank's group. Sarah swung the Barrett toward the target and fired without hesitation. The 50 caliber bullet shattered the window frame and eliminated the threat before he could fire. Rodriguez's voice came through clearly now. "Outstanding shooting, Doc. You just saved our lives." But Sarah knew the battle was far from over. More Taliban fighters were converging on their position, and ammunition for the Barrett was limited. She had 8 rounds left in the magazine and couldn't see any additional ammunition in the room. Tank and Davis reached the compound with Johnson and took cover on the first floor. Sarah could hear them moving below her, setting up a defensive position. Johnson was stable but needed proper medical attention soon. "Martinez," Tank called up the stairs, "how much ammo do you have?" 8 rounds left, Sarah replied, continuing to scan through the scope. Tank understood the implications immediately. 8 rounds wouldn't be enough to hold off the remaining Taliban fighters. They needed extraction soon, or they would be overwhelmed. Davis got on the radio with the helicopter crew. "Black Hawk 7-1, what's your status on extraction?" The response was not encouraging. "Still taking fire at the landing zone. We need that area secured before we can attempt pickup." Sarah studied the terrain around the landing zone through her scope. She could see at least 6 Taliban fighters positioned around the area, using natural cover to prevent the helicopter from landing. They were too far away for Tank's team to engage effectively, but they were well within range of the Barrett. "I can clear the landing zone," Sarah announced, "but I'll need to expose myself to get the angles." Tank's voice was firm. "Negative. Too risky." But Sarah was already moving. She had spotted a partially collapsed wall on the east side of the building that would give her a clear shot at the landing zone while providing some protection. It was dangerous, but it was their best chance. Sarah carried the massive rifle to the new position, grunting under its weight. The collapsed wall created a natural shooting rest, and she could see the entire landing zone through the scope. The first Taliban fighter was hiding behind a large rock about 600 meters away. At that distance, the Barrett was still devastatingly accurate. Sarah lined up the shot and fired. The bullet struck the rock and sent fragments flying. The fighter behind it was eliminated instantly. The remaining fighters realized they were being engaged by a powerful sniper, but they couldn't locate Sarah's position. She was firing from an unexpected angle, and the distance made her muzzle flash difficult to spot. Sarah systematically engaged each target around the landing zone. The Barrett's massive bullets could penetrate any cover the fighters tried to use. With each shot, the recoil bruised her shoulder more severely, but she ignored the pain and continued firing. Within 5 minutes, she had cleared 4 of the 6 positions around the landing zone. But as she lined up her 7th shot, disaster struck. A Taliban fighter had climbed onto the roof of a nearby building and spotted her position. He fired a burst from his AK-47, and several bullets struck the wall near Sarah's head. Stone fragments cut her face, and she was forced to duck for cover. "I'm taking fire," Sarah called out. "Can't maintain overwatch." Rodriguez immediately engaged the new threat with his rifle, but the fighter was using good cover and was difficult to hit at that range. Meanwhile, the remaining Taliban fighters around the landing zone realized they were no longer under sniper fire and began repositioning. Sarah wiped blood from her face and got back behind the Barrett. She had 2 rounds left, and the helicopter crew was waiting for clearance to land. But the fighter on the roof was still shooting at her position, making accurate fire impossible. That's when Tank appeared beside her, breathing hard from climbing the stairs quickly. "Chief, what are you doing here?" Sarah asked. "Helping," Tank replied simply. He had brought his M4 rifle and several magazines of ammunition. "You clear the landing zone. I'll handle the shooter on the roof." Tank moved to a different window and began engaging the rooftop fighter with precise bursts of fire. The combination of pressure from both Tank and Rodriguez forced the Taliban fighter to keep his head down, giving Sarah the opportunity she needed. Sarah aimed at the 5th target around the landing zone, a fighter hiding behind a low wall about 400 meters away. The Barrett's crosshairs were steady despite her fatigue and adrenaline. She squeezed the trigger, and another target was eliminated. 1 target remained between them and extraction. Sarah swung the scope toward the final fighter, who was using a drainage ditch for cover. It was a difficult shot because only small parts of his body were visible, and the range was nearly 700 meters. Sarah had 1 bullet left. If she missed, The helicopter couldn't land safely, and they would remain trapped. The pressure was enormous, but she forced herself to breathe slowly and focus on the fundamentals of marksmanship. Wind was minimal, range was long but manageable, target was partially concealed but stationary. Sarah made minute adjustments to her aim and squeezed the trigger with steady pressure. The Barrett roared for the final time. Through the scope, Sarah saw the bullet impact exactly where she had aimed. The last threat around the landing zone was eliminated. "Landing zone is clear," Sarah announced on the radio. Within seconds, they could hear the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching. Black Hawk 7-1 was coming in for extraction, guided by the lights that Davis had set up around the compound. Tank clapped Sarah on the shoulder. "Outstanding shooting, Martinez. You just saved all our lives." But Sarah wasn't finished yet. As they prepared to evacuate Johnson, she spotted movement in the village. More Taliban fighters were arriving, probably reinforcements called in when the ambush began going wrong. They would reach the landing zone before the extraction was complete. "Tank," Sarah said urgently. "We have more fighters incoming from the south, at least a dozen of them." Tank looked through his rifle scope and confirmed what Sarah had seen. "Martinez, can you engage them with the Barrett?" Sarah shook her head. "I'm out of 50 cal ammo, but I have an idea." She had noticed several large fuel barrels near the building where the reinforcements were gathering. If she could hit one of those barrels with a tracer round from her M4, it might create an explosion that would stop the advance. Sarah switched to her M4 rifle and loaded a magazine containing tracer ammunition. The range was long for that weapon, but it was their only option. She aimed carefully at the largest fuel barrel and began firing single shots. The first 3 shots missed, but the fourth struck the barrel and penetrated. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a small flame appeared, quickly growing into a massive explosion as the fuel ignited. The blast lit up the night sky and sent the Taliban reinforcements diving for cover. Several of them were caught in the explosion, and the rest were too disoriented to continue their advance. Sarah's quick thinking had bought them the time they needed. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust, its crew chief immediately jumping out to help load Johnson. Tank, Davis, and Rodriguez carried their wounded teammate while Sarah provided overwatch with her M4. As they loaded Johnson into the helicopter, Tank turned to Sarah. "You're coming with us." Sarah shook her head. "Someone needs to provide rear security while you evacuate." "Martinez," Tank said firmly, "you've done enough. Get on the bird." But Sarah had spotted more movement in the village. The Taliban weren't finished yet. And she knew that someone needed to keep them suppressed until the helicopter could take off safely. "Go," she told Tank. "I'll be right behind you." Tank hesitated, clearly torn between following orders and protecting his team member. Finally, he made his decision. 30 seconds, Martinez. Then you're on that helicopter whether you're ready or not." Sarah nodded and took position behind the Barrett, even though she had no ammunition for it. She hoped the sight of the massive rifle would be enough to keep the Taliban fighters at bay for a few more moments. The helicopter's rotors spun up to take off power, and Tank gave her the signal to move. Sarah grabbed her medical bag and sprinted toward the aircraft, diving through the open door just as it lifted off. As they climbed into the night sky, Sarah looked down at the village where she had faced her first real combat. She had gone into that battle as an untested medic, but she was leaving as a proven warrior who had saved her entire team. Tank leaned over and shouted above the rotor noise, "Martinez, when we get back, you're getting a new job title. You're not just our medic anymore. You're our sniper medic." Sarah smiled despite her exhaustion. She had proven that being only a medic was about much more than treating wounds. Sometimes saving lives meant being willing to take them, and sometimes the person who could do both was exactly what a team needed to survive. Johnson squeezed her hand weakly as the helicopter carried them toward safety. "Thanks, Doc," he whispered. "You saved all of us." Sarah looked at her teammates' faces in the dim cabin light. These men had accepted her as an equal, trusted her with their lives, and given her the chance to prove herself when it mattered most. Tank had handed her his Barrett 50 cal, not because he had to, but because he believed she could use it effectively. As they flew through the Afghan night toward medical evacuation and safety, Sarah realized that her journey from small-town farm girl to combat medic was just the beginning. She had found her calling in the most unlikely place, proving that heroes come in all sizes and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a rifle, but the courage to use it when everything depends on that moment. The helicopter disappeared into the darkness, carrying a team that had learned an important lesson. Never underestimate someone based on their job title. Sarah Martinez had been only a medic when the mission started, but she had become something much more by the time it ended. She had become the person who refused to let her teammates die, no matter what it took to save them.